If I had gotten in that RV, none of this would have happened. Those were the words of Jason Chandler, who spent 17 years searching for the truth behind his family's mysterious disappearance during a seemingly ordinary road trip. But when a long drought revealed the floor of a forgotten reservoir, it uncovered secrets buried for decades, and what he found will leave you speechless. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Jason Chandler's life had settled into a predictable routine of work, solitary meals, and nights spent poring over old maps and newspaper clippings. 17 years had passed since his family vanished on what was supposed to be their final road trip together before his sister Abby left for college. His modest apartment walls were covered with timeline charts, regional maps with highlighted routes, and photographs of his father Mark, mother Lisa, and sister Abby, all frozen in time from the summer of 2003. Though everyone else had long since classified the case as an unsolvable tragedy, Jason had built his entire adult existence around the search, transforming his childhood bedroom into an unofficial investigation headquarters. At 42, Jason had become a familiar figure in the small towns dotting Nevada's rural landscape. Local sheriffs knew him by name, motel owners saved newspaper clippings about reservoir levels for him, and gas station attendants would occasionally pass along rumors about abandoned vehicles or strange occurrences in the vast desert wilderness. The obsession had cost him dearly. A marriage that collapsed under the weight of his fixation, career opportunities sacrificed for yet another lead, and friendships that couldn't compete with the ghosts of his past. Yet in this strange half-life, Jason had found a peculiar comfort, a purpose that kept him moving forward when others would have surrendered to despair. His routine rarely varied. Wake at dawn, work remotely as a freelance data analyst to fund his ongoing investigation, then spend evenings methodically reviewing evidence and connecting with online communities dedicated to missing persons cases. Twice a year, he would retrace the family's planned route, stopping at the same diners and viewpoints, asking the same questions to increasingly sympathetic but unhelpful locals. This persistence had earned him a reputation. Some viewed him with pity, others with admiration for his unwavering devotion, but most simply accepted his presence as another fixture in the desolate landscape, like the twisted Joshua trees or abandoned mining equipment. Tonight was like any other as Jason sat at his kitchen table, reviewing the water level reports for Hawthorne Reservoir. The severe drought affecting the region had exposed long submerged shorelines and structures, creating what Jason saw as new opportunities. Several other cold cases across the Southwest had been solved when dropping water levels revealed sunken vehicles and, in some cases, remains. While part of him dreaded what might be uncovered, another part clung to the possibility of answers, of an end to the limbo that had defined nearly half his life. He marked potential areas to explore on his upcoming trip, carefully noting GPS coordinates for spots where the receding waterline might have exposed new evidence. As he prepared for bed, Jason paused at the living room wall, where a faded family portrait hung, the four of them smiling in front of the Winnebago Brave that his father had lovingly maintained. He touched the frame gently, a ritual performed countless times, and whispered the same promise he'd made for 17 years. "I'm still looking." Outside his window, a late autumn storm gathered force over the distant mountains, clouds heavy with the first significant rainfall the region had seen in months. Unknown to Jason, these rains would set in motion a chain of events that would finally bring to light what the desert had kept hidden for nearly 2 decades. Jason's one-bedroom apartment felt smaller each year, as if the walls were gradually closing in around him. Most people filled their living spaces with memories of new experiences, vacations, relationships, achievements. Jason's space remained frozen in 2003, the year time stopped for him. His few concessions to the passing years were purely practical: a newer laptop for research, updated software for analyzing satellite imagery, and a growing collection of external hard drives containing digitized records of every article, interview, and police report related to the case. Despite the passage of time, Jason's desire for closure had never dimmed. If anything, it had crystallized into something harder and more focused with each passing year. Every birthday, holiday, and anniversary marked another milestone his family had missed, another reminder of the questions that haunted him. Did they suffer? Could he have saved them had he joined the trip instead of staying behind for that summer job? And most persistent of all, was there something he had overlooked, some clue that everyone else had dismissed? These questions sustained him through the years, when friends and even the authorities suggested he seek therapy and move on with his life. For Jason, moving on wasn't an option until he knew the truth, however painful it might be. His persistence had made him something of an expert in the geography and history of the region. He could recite from memory the weather conditions on the day his family vanished, the names of every search and rescue officer involved in the initial investigation, and the depth of Hawthorne Reservoir during each season since the disappearance. This encyclopedic knowledge earned him reluctant respect from Sergeant Alvarez, who had inherited the cold case 5 years ago. While she maintained professional skepticism about Jason's theories, she couldn't help but admire his methodical approach and occasionally found herself calling him when new technologies or techniques might be applied to the old evidence. That morning, Jason received his regular email alert about regional reservoir levels from a contact at the Water Authority. The drought had caused Hawthorne to recede to its lowest point in decades, exposing sections that had been underwater since before the family's disappearance. With trembling hands, he downloaded the satellite images, noting with a surge of anticipation that the northeast inlet, precisely where a single tire track had led before disappearing at the water's edge during the original investigation, was now completely exposed. The timing seemed significant. In just 2 weeks, it would be the anniversary of the disappearance, a date that always intensified Jason's need for answers. He called in sick to his remote data entry job, packed his gear, and was on the road within an hour. As he drove, the car radio reported that volunteer diving teams were taking advantage of the low water levels to conduct environmental surveys and cleanup operations throughout the region's reservoirs. Jason paid little attention to this news, focused instead on reaching the newly exposed shoreline before weather conditions changed. The autumn storm that had passed through overnight had cleared, leaving behind crystal skies and sharply defined visibility that would be perfect for searching the newly revealed terrain. As Jason neared the turnoff to Hawthorne, his phone rang. Sergeant Alvarez, whose calls were rare enough to immediately set his heart racing. He pulled over, hands unsteady as he answered. Her voice was controlled, but couldn't completely mask an undercurrent of urgency. "Jason, where are you right now? There's something you need to see at Hawthorne. A volunteer dive team reported an anomaly on their sonar early this morning. They think it's a vehicle, and it's the right size to be an RV." The world seemed to stop around him as 17 years of searching crystallized into this single moment. "I'm 20 minutes away," he managed to reply, already restarting the engine. "I'll meet you there." The drive to Hawthorne felt both endless and too short. Jason's mind raced through possibilities, trying to manage his expectations. How many times had promising leads ended in disappointment? A sunken boat mistaken for a vehicle, debris that turned out to be construction waste, tire tracks that belonged to maintenance vehicles. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, the familiar desert landscape blurring as his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The old Toyota's engine strained as he pushed it harder than usual, dust billowing behind him on the unpaved access road. The scene at Hawthorne Reservoir was unlike anything Jason had imagined during his years of searching. Yellow police tape cordoned off a section of the normally quiet shoreline, and a small crowd of officials gathered around a staging area where divers in black wetsuits emerged from the water in rotation. A large mechanical winch had been set up on the reinforced bank, its thick cables disappearing into the murky depths. Jason's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he spotted the unmistakable shape of white vehicle panels being slowly raised from the water, algae and silt dripping from surfaces that had been hidden from the sun for 17 years. The Winnebago Brave, or what remained of it, was finally returning to the surface. Its white and blue exterior, now a ghostly gray after years beneath the reservoir. Sergeant Alvarez intercepted Jason before he could rush past the police line. Her normally stoic expression had softened, and she placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Jason, I need you to prepare yourself. The vehicle matches the description and partial plate numbers we have on file. We don't know what we're going to find inside, and I need your promise that you'll let the recovery team do their job." Jason nodded mechanically, his eyes never leaving the emerging wreckage. The front windshield was remarkably intact, though coated with a film of sediment that obscured the interior. As the winch continued its work, the RV tilted, sending a cascade of water pouring from its partially open side door, a detail that immediately caught Jason's attention. For 17 years, he had imagined the vehicle sealed shut, a watery tomb. The open door suggested something else entirely. The recovery operation continued with methodical precision. Environmental specialists monitored for fuel leakage while forensic photographers documented every stage of the process. Jason stood apart from the officials, a civilian observer to a scene that represented both the culmination of his search and the confirmation of his worst fears. When the Winnebago was finally secured on solid ground, a respectful silence fell over the assembled workers. No one approached the vehicle immediately, a tacit acknowledgement of what likely awaited inside. Jason felt Alvarez's grip tighten on his arm as the forensic team prepared to enter the RV. "You don't have to be here for this part," she offered quietly, but Jason shook his head. He had spent 17 years searching. He wouldn't turn away now. The initial examination revealed something unexpected. There were no remains inside the driver or passenger compartments. The interior showed signs of a violent impact, with the steering column crushed and the dashboard splintered, but the front seats were empty. Further inspection revealed water damage consistent with long-term submersion, but certain areas of the RV's living quarters suggested that water had entered gradually rather than in a catastrophic rush. Most surprising of all was the discovery of Abby's Sony camcorder, sealed in a waterproof case and wedged beneath one of the fixed dining benches. The lead forensic technician carefully bagged the device, explaining that while the chances were slim, specialized labs might be able to recover data from the VHS tape still inside. As daylight faded and powerful floodlights illuminated the recovery site, Jason found himself standing before a folding table where salvaged items from the RV were being cataloged. His father's water-damaged ID, his mother's silver locket, maps annotated in his father's precise handwriting, and a collection of sodden books that Abby had packed for college. But it was a maintenance logbook, its pages swollen but partially legible, that caught his attention. In the margin of the final entry, his father had jotted a name and what appeared to be a phone number. Kavanaugh, Service Road Access? The note might have seemed innocuous to the investigators, but to Jason, who had memorized every detail of his family's last days, it was an entirely new thread, one his father had never mentioned, on a route they hadn't planned to take. As the forensic team prepared to transport the Winnebago to a secure facility for more thorough examination, Jason realized he wasn't at the end of his search at all, but rather on the threshold of a much darker investigation. The light was almost gone now, the desert darkness descending rapidly as it always did. The floodlights cast harsh shadows across the recovery scene, giving everything an otherworldly quality. Jason watched as they carefully loaded the camcorder into an evidence transport vehicle, specially padded to protect fragile items. He couldn't take his eyes off it. That small device might contain the last images of his family alive. His throat tightened at the thought. The specialized forensic lab in Carson City worked miracles with Abby's recovered camcorder. 3 days after the Winnebago's discovery, Jason sat in a small viewing room alongside Sergeant Alvarez and 2 technicians as they prepared to play what they had salvaged from the damaged VHS tape. The atmosphere was tense. No one knew what the footage might reveal, but all understood its potential significance. The screen flickered to life, showing Abby, 17 and full of life, narrating what she called her emotional time capsule of the family's final road trip. The early footage was mundane, her father checking tire pressure, her mother reading a paperback in the passenger seat, roadside attractions, and inside jokes that now carried the unbearable weight of impending tragedy. Jason watched transfixed as these ghosts from the past moved and spoke with no awareness of what awaited them. Then came the storm, sudden and violent in a way that weather reports from that day hadn't indicated. The camera captured heavy rain lashing against the windshield as Mark Chandler struggled to maintain control on a road Jason didn't recognize. Lisa's voice could be heard, urging Mark to pull over, while Abby's filming became erratic. Then came a sharp swerve, screams, and the sickening sound of impact before the screen went black. The technicians exchanged glances, but Jason leaned forward, gesturing for them to continue. After several seconds of darkness, the footage resumed, now showing the Winnebago's interior tilted at an unnatural angle, water visible through the windows, rising slowly. Abby's terrified voice narrated her attempts to rouse her unconscious parents as water began seeping through the door seals. What followed was the most difficult footage Jason had ever witnessed. His sister's desperate attempts to open doors jammed by the impact, her realization that water was filling the vehicle, and her final decision to try the partially damaged side exit. The camera had been abandoned during this attempt, continuing to record hours of darkness and the sound of water until its battery finally died. Just as the technicians prepared to stop the playback, a final clip appeared, recorded hours later, showing a mud-covered Abby whispering into the camera. "I tried to get them out. The doors wouldn't open. I think I hear something outside." The image froze on her frightened face, leaving Jason with the devastating realization that his sister had survived the initial crash, only to face an unknown fate afterward. This new information transformed the investigation. What had been presumed an accident now carried troubling implications of something more sinister. The service road his father had noted wasn't on official maps, and the name Kavanaugh yielded nothing in initial database searches. More puzzling was the location itself. The Winnebago had been found miles from the family's planned route, in an area accessible only by unmarked maintenance roads that would have required gate access. Jason threw himself into this new phase of investigation with the focus of someone who had finally glimpsed the truth after years of darkness, spending hours at the county records office researching property boundaries and access permissions around Hawthorne Reservoir in 2003. A breakthrough came when Jason discovered that environmental testing companies had been contracted to monitor water quality at several remote sections of the reservoir during that period. Cross-referencing these contracts with employee records eventually produced a match. Robert Kavanaugh, a field technician who had worked for a subcontractor of Thermax Logistics, the same company that had employed Mark Chandler. The connection sent a chill through Jason. His father had never mentioned knowing anyone at the testing sites, yet had apparently sought access information for the service road. More disturbing was the discovery that Kavanaugh was still in the area, now working as part of the volunteer dive team that had first located the sunken Winnebago. With this information, Jason and Sergeant Alvarez began constructing a timeline that contradicted the accident theory. The storm that night had been severe but localized, almost directly over the reservoir area where the Winnebago was found. Weather data showed it had formed suddenly and dissipated just as quickly, unusual for the region and season. The service road would have been accessible only to someone with a key to the maintenance gate. And most compelling of all was the audio analysis of Abby's final recording, which revealed a rhythmic humming in the background that audio experts identified as another vehicle's engine, not natural sounds. As these pieces fell into place, Jason realized his family hadn't simply disappeared in an accident. They had been deliberately silenced, and the reason was likely hidden in the work his father had been doing at Thermax Logistics. The county records office became Jason's second home. The elderly clerk, Mrs. Pemberton, saved him a desk near the window and brought him coffee without asking. She'd watched his search for years, sometimes helping him navigate the labyrinthine filing system. Today she placed the weathered logbook beside his coffee mug. The forensic lab continued working on Abby's damaged tape, using advanced techniques to recover additional fragments that had initially been deemed unsalvageable. 5 days after the Winnebago's discovery, Jason received an urgent call from Sergeant Alvarez requesting his immediate presence. When he arrived at the station, he found her in a secure viewing room with the lab technicians, their expressions grave. "We recovered more footage," she explained. "It was recorded over several hours, in fragments. The additional video showed Abby's journey after escaping the sinking vehicle, swimming to shore in the darkness, seeking shelter from the continuing storm, and finally, at dawn, attempting to navigate the unfamiliar terrain around the reservoir." Most revealing was a segment where she approached what appeared to be the maintenance gate, only to freeze at the sound of an approaching vehicle. The final recovered fragment was brief but chilling. Abby hiding behind rocks as headlights illuminated the area, followed by the sound of men's voices. Though their words were largely indistinct, one phrase came through with terrible clarity: "Chandler's daughter. Find her." The camera was apparently dropped or hidden at this point, capturing only audio of Abby's retreating footsteps, followed by shouts and the sound of pursuit, before the recording ended. The implications were unmistakable. Someone had deliberately targeted the Chandler family and had continued hunting Abby after she escaped the submerged vehicle. For Jason, this confirmed what his heart had always suspected. His family's disappearance was no accident. The revelation transformed his grief into cold, focused anger. Armed with this new evidence, Sergeant Alvarez obtained warrants to access Thermax Logistics archived records from 2003, focusing particularly on environmental testing reports and employee assignments around Hawthorne Reservoir. Meanwhile, Jason concentrated on tracking down Robert Kavanaugh, the technician whose name had appeared in his father's notes. Initial inquiries revealed that Kavanaugh had left Thermax shortly after the Chandler's disappearance, moving through a series of short-term positions before eventually settling in as a private environmental consultant specializing in water quality, a job that conveniently gave him access to various reservoirs throughout the region, including as a volunteer diver. What puzzled Jason was Kavanaugh's involvement in discovering the Winnebago. Had guilt driven him to participate in the volunteer dive program, knowing the drought might reveal evidence of his past actions? Or was he monitoring the site, ensuring that whatever secrets lay beneath the water remained hidden? Most suspicious was the timing. County records showed that Kavanaugh had accessed the service road just days before the Chandler's disappearance, and again the day after. When confronted with these records, the current management at Thermax claimed they were part of routine testing, but could provide no specific reports from those dates. The gaps in documentation suggested a deliberate purging of potentially incriminating information. The most significant breakthrough came when Jason discovered his father's hidden email account while searching through old family records. The password, a combination of Abby's birthday and their first home's address, unlocked years of archived messages, including several sent in the weeks before the fatal trip. These emails revealed that Mark Chandler had uncovered evidence of Thermax illegally disposing of toxic chemicals at remote testing sites, including areas around Hawthorne Reservoir. More damning were attached documents showing a complex network of shell companies created to hide liability. The final email, sent just hours before the family departed on their trip, contained a single line: "Taking everything with me, We'll contact federal authorities when we return. With this, the puzzle pieces locked into place, Mark Chandler hadn't been planning just a family vacation. He had been attempting to gather evidence and escape with his family before exposing a massive corporate conspiracy. Jason stared at the screen, reading the email again and again. His hands shook slightly as he clicked through the attached documents, spreadsheets showing chemical disposal amounts that didn't match official reports, internal memos discussing alternative disposal methods to avoid regulatory costs, maps marking isolated areas around reservoirs throughout Nevada and neighboring states. It all made horrible sense now. His father hadn't just stumbled onto something. He had meticulously documented it, gathering evidence for months. The road trip, that final family vacation before Abby left for college, had been a cover. Mark Chandler had planned to put his family safely out of reach before turning everything over to federal authorities. Locating Robert Kavanaugh proved surprisingly easy, almost as if he wanted to be found. The former technician now lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Reno, his diving equipment visible through the garage windows. Jason observed the property for 2 days, noting Kavanaugh's solitary routine and the nervous glances he cast at passing vehicles. On the third morning, as Kavanaugh left for his regular coffee run, Jason approached him directly in the local diner. "You knew my father, Mark Chandler," he stated, sliding into the booth opposite the startled man. Kavanaugh's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips, his weathered face draining of color. "You've been waiting 17 years for someone to say that to you," Jason continued, laying out printed copies of the service road access logs. "I'm not leaving until you tell me what happened to my family." The confession came in fragments, extracted over hours as Kavanaugh alternated between defensive justifications and apparent remorse. He admitted to being part of Thermax's illegal disposal operation, describing how they had used the environmental testing program as cover to dump chemical waste in remote areas around several western reservoirs. Mark Chandler had stumbled onto financial discrepancies that pointed to these activities and had begun gathering evidence. "They just wanted to scare him off," Kavanaugh insisted, hands trembling around his coffee cup. "The storm wasn't part of the plan. We were supposed to run him off the road, take the documents, make it look like a robbery gone wrong. But the rain came out of nowhere, visibility went to hell, and the impact was harder than intended. By the time I reached the vehicle, it was already sliding into the water." Jason listened with growing horror as Kavanaugh described watching the Winnebago sink, convinced everyone inside was already dead or unconscious. "I didn't know about your sister until later, that she'd gotten out." His voice dropped to a whisper. "When the others found out, they went looking for her. I wasn't part of that, I swear. I couldn't stop them, but I couldn't be part of it either." The others remained unnamed, though Kavanaugh referenced someone called Harland, who had orchestrated the cover-up and apparently still wielded considerable influence. What Kavanaugh couldn't, or wouldn't, explain was why he had chosen now to lead the diving team to the Winnebago. "Maybe conscience, maybe fear," he muttered. "They've been watching me for years. I knew the drought would expose it eventually. Better to control how it was found." Miss Sergeant Alvarez's assistance, Jason convinced Kavanaugh to provide a formal statement, promising reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation. As they left the diner, Kavanaugh suddenly grabbed Jason's arm. "There's more. Evidence your father gathered. I kept it. Insurance, you know? Come to my house tonight, after dark, alone." Against Alvarez's explicit instructions, Jason arrived at the appointed time, finding Kavanaugh anxiously watching the street through partially closed blinds. The former technician led him to a basement storage room where he unlocked a concealed floor safe. Inside was a waterproof document case containing what appeared to be the very evidence Mark Chandler had been transporting: financial records, soil samples with location data, and internal memos explicitly directing the illegal dumping operations. Most damning was a list of officials who had been bribed to overlook violations, including several who now occupied prominent positions in both private industry and government regulatory agencies. As Jason examined the documents, headlights swept across the front of the house. Kavanaugh's face contorted with fear. "They followed you, or me. They've been waiting for a mistake." He thrust the document case into Jason's hands and pushed him toward a back door. "Get this to your sergeant. It's all there. Names, dates, locations. Enough to bring them all down." Jason had barely reached the rear yard when he heard the crash of the front door being forced open, followed by shouts and then, most horrifying of all, the distinct sound of gunshots. Clutching the case, Jason fled into the darkness, the weight of the evidence matched only by the weight of knowing that Kavanaugh had likely just paid with his life for his confession. The night air felt thick as Jason darted between houses, the document case clutched against his chest. Behind him, car doors slammed and flashlight beams cut through the darkness. He pulled out his phone to call Alvarez, but hesitated. What if someone was monitoring her communications? What if the police had been compromised too? Kavanaugh's words echoed in his mind, enough to bring them all down. That included people in positions of power, people who could access police communications, people who would know exactly where Jason went if he called for help. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of safe houses, formal statements, and crushing guilt. Kavanaugh had indeed been killed, shot 3 times by what police described as professional assailants who left no traceable evidence. Jason found himself under protective custody while federal authorities were brought in to examine the documents from Kavanaugh's safe. The evidence was as damning as promised, a comprehensive record of Thermax Logistics' illegal activities spanning several states, along with the network of officials who had facilitated and concealed the operations. Sergeant Alvarez, now working alongside federal agents, maintained a constant presence, her initial professional skepticism having evolved into a fierce determination to see the case through to its conclusion, regardless of who might be implicated. As the investigation expanded, Jason struggled with the realization that what he had sought for 17 years, the truth about his family's fate, had resulted in more death and placed him squarely in the crosshairs of powerful individuals with everything to lose. The protective custody, while necessary, returned him to a state of isolation reminiscent of his years of searching, with one crucial difference. He now knew that his father had died not in a tragic accident, but as a direct result of his integrity. Mark Chandler had uncovered corruption and had refused to look the other way, a choice that had ultimately cost him and his family their lives. This knowledge provided a strange comfort amid the danger and uncertainty. His father had been the man Jason had always believed him to be. The evidence package included a particularly disturbing discovery: photographs of what appeared to be Abby's necklace, a distinctive silver pendant their father had given her upon high school graduation, taken near a dried inlet several miles from where the Winnebago had been found. This suggested that Abby had managed to travel a significant distance after escaping the submerged vehicle, only to be intercepted by the individuals Kavanaugh had referenced. With this new information, authorities expanded their search to include the area around the inlet, now exposed by the receding waters of the drought. Within days, forensic teams recovered additional evidence, including partial footprints preserved in what had once been mud but had hardened over years of submersion. And most significantly, cloth fragments consistent with the clothing Abby had been wearing in the final recovered video footage. As federal investigators built their case, they encountered resistance from unexpected quarters. Warrants were delayed, witnesses became suddenly unavailable, and certain documents mysteriously disappeared from county archives. It became increasingly clear that the network Harland had built remained at least partially intact, with individuals in positions of influence working to obstruct the investigation. Most concerning was the discovery that someone had accessed the secure database containing details of Jason's protective custody arrangement, suggesting that those responsible for Kavanaugh's death were now targeting him as the final loose end in a 17-year-old cover-up. This revelation forced another relocation, this time to a safe house known only to Alvarez and 2 federal agents she personally vetted. In this isolated setting, Jason finally had time to process the full implications of what he had uncovered. His search for answers had exposed a conspiracy far larger than he had imagined, one that had not only claimed his family, but had potentially caused environmental damage affecting countless others across multiple states. The corporate executives and officials involved had spent nearly 2 decades building power and influence, all while knowing their success was built on criminal actions and the silencing of the Chandler family. As federal agents prepared to move against the first tier of conspirators, Jason made a decision that Alvarez strongly opposed. He would return to his apartment, seemingly resuming his normal routine, to draw out those who sought to silence him. "They've been watching me for years anyway," he argued. "The difference now is that we'll be watching them too." Despite her objections, Alvarez recognized the strategic value of using Jason as visible bait while maintaining covert surveillance on anyone who approached him. The trap was set, with Jason returning to the familiar confines of his apartment, now wired with hidden cameras and surrounded by undercover agents, armed with the truth, but acutely aware that this knowledge had placed him directly in harm's way. The safe house was a small cabin on the outskirts of Carson City, its location carefully chosen for both seclusion and quick escape routes. Jason spent hours at the simple wooden table, organizing Kavanaugh's documents with Alvarez and the federal agents. The more they uncovered, the broader the conspiracy appeared. Chemical samples that should have been properly disposed of at regulated facilities had instead been dumped at remote sites throughout the region. Water quality reports had been falsified, inspectors had been bribed, and when someone threatened to expose it all, they had been silenced permanently. Jason's return to his apartment marked a profound shift in his approach to his family's case. Where once he had been driven by uncertainty and desperate hope, he now operated with the cold precision of someone who had glimpsed the full scope of what he was facing. The walls once covered in maps and timelines had been cleared, replaced with a deliberately crafted image of a man returning to normal life after a traumatic discovery. He maintained his regular routines: morning coffee at the local shop, remote work sessions at the library, evening walks along the same predictable route, all while aware that his movements were likely being monitored by both the protective detail Alvarez had arranged and those who had ordered Kavanaugh's execution. The familiar surroundings now felt alien, a stage set for the final act of a tragedy that had begun 17 years earlier. The surveillance team recorded multiple instances of suspicious activity: a telephone repair van with no service scheduled, a jogger who appeared on the same route 3 days in succession despite not living in the neighborhood, and most tellingly, an attempted digital intrusion into Jason's home network that federal technicians traced to a shell company with connections to Thermax's former general counsel. Rather than intervening immediately, Alvarez made the tactical decision to allow these surveillance efforts to continue while gathering intelligence on the individuals involved. "They're getting sloppy," she observed during one of their clandestine meetings in a department store changing room. "Whoever Harland is, he's feeling the pressure." People who've operated with impunity for nearly 2 decades don't like suddenly being watched. As the net tightened around Thermax's former executives, Jason received an unexpected call from a burner phone number. The voice was disguised, but the message was clear. "Hawthorne Inlet, midnight. Come alone if you want to know about Abby's last hours." Despite Alvarez's vehement objections, Jason insisted on keeping the appointment, arguing that the team could establish surveillance positions and be prepared to intervene. "This might be our only chance to identify Harland," he argued, the pain of not knowing his sister's fate overriding his natural caution. Reluctantly, Alvarez agreed to a heavily monitored operation, with Jason wired for sound and a tactical team positioned around the meeting point at the dried inlet where Abby's necklace had been found. The midnight meeting unfolded with nightmarish precision. Jason arrived to find a middle-aged man in nondescript clothing waiting by the shoreline, his features obscured by the shadows of the surrounding rocks. As Jason approached, the man spoke without turning. "Your father wasn't supposed to die. None of them were. Just scared off, documents taken. That was the plan." He finally turned, revealing a face that Jason didn't recognize, but that the surveillance team would later identify as William Marsh, a former security consultant for Thermax who had disappeared shortly after the Chandler's disappearance. "Your sister made it this far," Marsh continued, gesturing to the dried inlet. "Smart girl. Nearly reached the highway before they caught up with her." The dispassionate way he described Abby's final moments sent a surge of rage through Jason. But he maintained his composure, aware that the recording needed to be clear. What neither Jason nor the surveillance team had anticipated was the presence of a second individual, a sniper positioned on the ridge overlooking the inlet. The first shot struck Marsh in the chest mid-sentence, the second kicking up dust at Jason's feet as he dove for cover. In the chaos that followed, the tactical team moved in, exchanging fire with the unseen shooter while extracting Jason and the mortally wounded Marsh. As medics worked frantically to stabilize him, Marsh gasped out a final revelation. "Harland, not his real name. He's still there, Energy Commission, protected," before succumbing to his injuries. The sniper escaped in the darkness, but left behind a crucial piece of evidence: a custom rifle with serial numbers that would eventually be traced to a private security firm with contracts throughout the western states, including several with regulatory agencies overseeing environmental compliance. With Marsh's dying words and this physical evidence, the investigation entered a new phase. Focusing on identifying the mysterious Harland within the state's Energy Commission, a search that would require Jason to step back from his role as visible bait and work instead through official channels, his personal vendetta now aligned with a federal corruption probe that stretched across multiple agencies and states. The wind whistled through the dried reeds at the inlet, carrying the metallic smell of the exposed reservoir bed. Jason crouched behind a boulder, heart hammering in his chest, as federal agents secured the area. The tactical team leader, a veteran named Rodriguez, helped him to his feet. "You okay?" he asked, eyes scanning the ridgeline where the sniper had been positioned. Jason nodded mechanically, his gaze fixed on the spot where Marsh had fallen. Blood darkened the pale soil, already being processed by a forensic technician with a camera and collection kit. The federal task force investigating the Thermax conspiracy established a secure operations center in an unmarked office building on the outskirts of Carson City. Here, Jason worked alongside Sergeant Alvarez and a team of investigators, analyzing decades of appointments to various state regulatory bodies, cross-referencing names with Thermax's former contractors and consultants. The work was methodical and often frustrating, hampered by missing records and the careful compartmentalization that had protected the conspiracy for so many years. Jason found himself drawing on skills honed during his long search: the patience to sift through seemingly unrelated documents, the ability to recognize patterns in disparate data points, and most importantly, the unwavering determination to follow even the faintest lead to its conclusion. 3 weeks into this painstaking investigation, a pattern began to emerge. Several key regulatory decisions benefiting Thermax and similar companies could be traced to recommendations from advisory committees headed by Dr. Andrew Harlow, a respected environmental scientist whose career had included positions at multiple universities and governmental agencies. While Harlow didn't immediately connect to Harland, further investigation revealed that Harlow had briefly published under the name A.R. Harland early in his academic career before standardizing his professional name. More suspicious was the discovery that Harlow had served as a consultant for a subsidiary of Thermax during precisely the period when the illegal dumping operations had been established, though this connection had been carefully obscured through a series of shell companies and consulting arrangements. As the task force built its case against Harlow, They uncovered a sophisticated network of influence that extended far beyond environmental regulations. Through strategic appointments, consulting arrangements, and targeted political donations, Harlow had positioned himself and his allies throughout the state's regulatory framework, creating a system where corporate interests routinely overrode environmental protections and safety standards. Most disturbing was the evidence suggesting that the Chandlers' case was not unique. Several accidents and disappearances over the years coincided with moments when the illegal operations might have been exposed, creating a pattern of silenced whistleblowers and conveniently timed tragedies that had allowed the conspiracy to continue unchecked for nearly 2 decades. The challenge now was building a case strong enough to overcome the considerable political and institutional protection Harlow enjoyed. Direct evidence linking him to Mark Chandler's death remained elusive, with most participants in the original operation either dead, like Kavanaugh and Marsh, or untraceable. However, the financial records from Mark's hidden evidence cache provided a crucial thread: a series of payments from Thermax subsidiaries to shell companies controlled by individuals now identified as Harlow's associates, corresponding precisely with dates of known dumping operations and subsequent cover-up activities. When combined with soil and water samples that still showed chemical traces matching Thermax's waste profile, these financial records offered compelling evidence of both the environmental crimes and the elaborate measures taken to conceal them. As the case against Harlow solidified, Jason found himself wrestling with conflicting emotions. The identification of his family's likely killer should have brought a sense of closure, but instead opened new wounds. Unlike Kavanaugh, who had shown remorse and ultimately assisted the investigation at the cost of his life, or even Marsh, who had at least acknowledged the wrongness of what had occurred, Harlow remained a distant figure of calculated malice, a man who had ordered the deaths of 3 innocent people and likely the pursuit of Abby after she escaped, simply to protect his financial interests and power. This realization brought with it a disturbing question that kept Jason awake at night. Was bringing Harlow to legal justice enough? The system he had so thoroughly corrupted might still offer him protections and privileges denied to those he had harmed. As the task force prepared to move against Harlow with search warrants and subpoenas, Jason found himself contemplating darker alternatives, thoughts that he shared with no one, not even Alvarez, whose faith in the justice system remained unshaken despite the corruption they had uncovered. The operations center hummed with focused energy as agents compiled evidence and prepared documentation for the various warrants and subpoenas they would need. Jason sat at a computer terminal, scrolling through academic papers Harlow had published over the years. The man's credentials were impeccable: PhD from Berkeley, research positions at prestigious environmental institutes, advisory roles on multiple state and federal committees. On paper, Harlow appeared to be exactly what his reputation suggested: a dedicated scientist committed to environmental protection. The perfect cover for someone orchestrating widespread environmental crimes. The operation to arrest Andrew Harlow was planned with military precision, coordinated across multiple jurisdictions to simultaneously serve warrants at his office at the Energy Commission, his upscale home in a gated community, and the headquarters of his consulting firm. What the task force hadn't anticipated was Harlow's extensive surveillance of law enforcement communications, a network of informants and electronic monitoring that provided him just enough warning to implement contingency plans he had apparently maintained for years. By the time federal agents reached his home, Harlow had already fled, leaving behind evidence of hastily burned documents and wiped hard drives. His private jet had departed from a small regional airport just 30 minutes before authorities arrived to secure it, bound for a country with limited extradition agreements with the United States. The apparent escape sent shockwaves through the task force, with accusations of leaks and compromised operational security. For Jason, the news brought a crushing sense of failure. After coming so close to justice for his family, the architect of their deaths, might now evade accountability entirely. However, the simultaneous raids did yield critical evidence, including hidden servers containing encrypted communications between Harlow and his network of associates. Particularly damning was a series of messages from the night of the Chandlers' disappearance, including one that chillingly read, "Maintenance complete at Hawthorne site, no loose ends." These messages, when combined with the financial records and Kavanaugh's testimony, provided enough evidence to secure indictments against several of Harlow's associates still within reach of U.S. jurisdiction, including 2 former Thermax executives and a current member of the State Environmental Review Board. As federal authorities launched an international manhunt for Harlow, Jason received an encrypted message on his personal email, one that had not been part of the investigation's monitored accounts. The message contained only geographic coordinates and a time, midnight, just 6 hours away. The location corresponded to a remote airstrip near the Nevada-California border, one that had appeared in Harlow's travel records as an occasional departure point for hunting trips to private land in the Sierra Nevada range. After his experience at the Hawthorne Inlet, Jason knew the extreme danger of such a meeting, but also recognized it as possibly the last opportunity to confront the man responsible for his family's fate. This time, however, he immediately shared the information with Alvarez, who mobilized a tactical team while attempting to secure airspace restrictions over the coordinates, a request that encountered mysterious administrative delays that further confirmed the extent of Harlow's remaining influence. The airstrip was deserted when Jason arrived, illuminated only by the moon and stars that hung with impossible clarity over the desert landscape. The tactical team had established positions in the surrounding terrain, but maintained radio silence as Jason approached the small hangar at the edge of the runway. Inside, he found not Harlow himself, but a secure tablet computer mounted on a stand, its screen displaying a live video feed. When Jason stepped into view of its camera, the feed shifted to show Andrew Harlow seated in what appeared to be the luxurious cabin of a private aircraft. "Mr. Chandler," he began without preamble, his voice cultured and utterly without remorse. "I thought we should meet, however virtually, before I leave this rather ungrateful country behind. Your persistence is remarkable, a family trait, it seems. Your father was equally stubborn." The conversation that followed was a study in contrasts, Jason's raw emotion against Harlow's clinical detachment as he calmly acknowledged orchestrating the operation that led to the Chandlers' deaths, justifying it as unfortunate but necessary risk management for a greater economic good. What Harlow hadn't counted on was that this entire exchange was being recorded not just by the tactical team's equipment, but by satellite uplinks the FBI had finally managed to authorize. His smug confession, intended as a final psychological twist of the knife to a victim he believed powerless to touch him, was instead being simultaneously transmitted to law enforcement agencies across multiple countries, including those with jurisdiction over the airspace his private jet was currently traversing. As Harlow concluded with a mocking toast to the last of the Chandlers, the video feed suddenly jerked, his expression changing from confidence to alarm, as voices could be heard in the background. The last image before the connection terminated was of uniformed officers entering the cabin, their insignia identifying them as belonging to the Air Policing Division of a European nation where the jet had been forced to land due to an equipment malfunction that was, in reality, a remotely triggered navigation system intervention by international authorities. The trap Jason had helped lay by simply appearing vulnerable and alone had succeeded beyond the task force's expectations. Not only had they secured Harlow's direct confession to orchestrating the Chandlers' deaths, but they had manipulated his ego and sense of invulnerability into revealing his escape route, allowing for his interception in international airspace before he could reach his intended haven. As dawn broke over the desert airstrip, Jason stood in silence as Alvarez confirmed that Harlow was in custody, and would be extradited to face charges including multiple counts of conspiracy to commit murder, environmental crimes affecting public health, obstruction of justice, and a host of financial offenses. The man who had remained untouchable for 17 years, who had built an empire on corruption and silenced anyone who threatened to expose him, had finally been undone by his own arrogance and the relentless determination of a son who refused to let his family be forgotten. The tablet screen had gone dark, but Jason continued to stare at it, trying to process what had just happened. Harlow's face lingered in his memory, the aristocratic features, the silver-gray hair, the complete absence of remorse. This was the man who had taken everything from him. This was the architect of his family's destruction, and now, after 17 years, he would face justice. The realization didn't bring the sense of triumph Jason had imagined during his long search. Instead, he felt hollow, as if a sustaining force had suddenly disappeared. Within 24 hours of Harlow's arrest, the story broke across national media outlets. Corporate cover-up exposed, family disappearance linked to environmental whistleblower silencing. Read the headlines, accompanied by photographs of the Chandler family alongside images of the recovered Winnebago and the dried shoreline of Hawthorne Reservoir. The reports detailed how Mark Chandler had uncovered evidence of illegal toxic dumping and had been targeted to prevent him from exposing the operation, resulting in the deaths of him and his wife, and the likely pursuit and murder of their daughter after she escaped the sinking vehicle. Jason watched from the sidelines as journalists pieced together the sprawling conspiracy, marveling at how a story that had consumed his entire adult life was now being condensed into 5-minute segments and feature articles that could never capture the full depth of loss and the years of searching that had led to this moment. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Environmental activists organized demonstrations outside Thermax Logistics' former headquarters. Now operating under a different name following a series of corporate restructurings that had been part of the cover-up, families from communities near the illegal dumping sites came forward with stories of unexplained health issues, launching a wave of civil lawsuits against the corporations implicated in Harlow's network. Most significantly, federal and state agencies launched comprehensive reviews of regulatory decisions made under Harlow's influence, with preliminary findings suggesting that the corruption extended far beyond environmental matters into energy contracts, land use permissions, and water rights allocations worth billions of dollars. What had begun as Jason's personal quest for answers about his family had blossomed into a full-scale reckoning with decades of corporate malfeasance and regulatory capture. As Harlow awaited trial in federal custody, denied bail due to his flight risk and the severity of the charges, his network began to unravel. Former associates rushed to make deals with prosecutors, offering testimony in exchange for reduced charges. These revelations expanded the scope of the investigation far beyond Nevada, implicating officials and executives across multiple states in what one federal prosecutor described as one of the most extensive environmental crimes and cover-up operations in U.S. history. The soil and water samples Mark Chandler had collected, preserved in the waterproof case Kavanaugh had hidden for 17 years, provided crucial physical evidence linking specific contamination events to Thermax's operations, while the financial records established the paper trail of bribes, shell companies, and falsified compliance reports that had allowed the illegal activities to continue unchecked for so long. For Jason, the national attention brought a complex mix of emotions. There was validation in seeing his family's story finally acknowledged and their deaths recognized, not as a tragic accident, but as deliberate silencing of a whistleblower. Yet he also struggled with the public nature of what had been a deeply personal loss and search. Journalists sought interviews, documentary filmmakers proposed projects, and even Hollywood producers made overtures about dramatizing the story. Alvarez, now something of a protective figure in Jason's life, helped shield him from the most intrusive inquiries, while encouraging him to consider which platforms might best honor his family's memory and ensure that the full truth of what had happened and been covered up for so long would become part of the historical record rather than being buried once more when the news cycle moved on. In the midst of this media storm, Jason received a package from the forensic laboratory that had analyzed Abby's recovered video footage. Inside was a restored version of what they had identified as her final recording, enhanced to clarify details previously obscured by damage and time. The accompanying note explained that this copy was for his personal archives only, not evidence, as the original remained in secure storage. That evening, alone in his apartment, Jason watched the enhanced footage, his sister's last moments of recorded life, her voice stronger and clearer than in previous versions as she described her attempts to save their parents and her growing fear as she heard vehicles approaching her hiding place. The final frame showed her looking directly into the camera, whispering words that had previously been inaudible but were now clear. Jason, if you're watching this, it wasn't an accident. Dad's papers are what they want. Don't let them bury this. Even in her final hours, terrified and alone, Abby had thought to leave a message, a truth that had waited 17 years to be heard. In that moment, Jason finally allowed himself to weep, not just for the family he had lost, but for the sister who had fought to her last moments to ensure the truth would eventually be known. Jason sat in his apartment, surrounded by boxes. After 17 years, he was finally packing up his investigation. The maps, timelines, and newspaper clippings that had covered his walls were now carefully organized in storage containers. Not discarded, he could now. On his coffee table lay an early edition of the Washington Post with the Chandler case splashed across the front page. Next to it, a framed photograph of his family that had been used in the original missing persons report, now cleaned and restored. Spring arrived at Hawthorne Reservoir, bringing gentle rains that began the slow process of refilling what the drought had exposed. Along the shoreline where the Winnebago had been discovered, wildflowers pushed through soil that had been submerged for decades before the drought revealed its secrets. It was here that Jason stood on the anniversary of the day he had received the call about the volunteer dive team's discovery, watching as the water level gradually reclaimed the inlet where evidence of Abby's final journey had been found. He came alone, though he knew Alvarez worried about him on these solitary pilgrimages. After months of investigations, testimonies, and media attention, he needed the quiet, a space to process not just what he had discovered, but who he had become through the long years of searching and the tumultuous months of revelation. The trials were underway, with Harlow and 3 former Thermax executives facing charges ranging from conspiracy to commit murder to environmental crimes affecting public health. The evidence was overwhelming, bolstered by testimony from former associates seeking leniency. Legal experts predicted convictions across the board, though appeals would likely extend the process for years. A separate class action lawsuit represented communities affected by the illegal dumping, seeking damages for health impacts and property devaluation. The corporate entities involved had already initiated settlement talks, recognizing the inevitability of significant financial penalties. For many observers, the case represented a rare example of corporate wrongdoers being held accountable for both human and environmental damage, a precedent that regulatory agencies were already citing in other investigations across the country. Jason had declined most interview requests, but had worked with a respected investigative journalist to document the full story, not just the corporate crime and cover-up, but the personal cost to his family and his own 17-year search. The resulting book, titled What Remains Below, had just been published to critical acclaim and public interest, with proceeds directed to a foundation Jason had established in his family's name. The foundation focused on supporting environmental whistleblowers and funding independent water quality monitoring in vulnerable communities, work that Mark Chandler would have recognized as carrying forward his own efforts to expose corporate pollution. Through this foundation, Jason had found purpose beyond his search, transforming his family's tragedy into a force for protection and accountability. Personal relationships, long sacrificed to his single-minded pursuit of answers, had begun to tentatively re-enter Jason's life. Alvarez had transitioned from professional ally to friend, her steady presence a counterbalance to the intensity of the ongoing legal proceedings. Former colleagues reached out, no longer viewing him through the lens of obsession that had previously defined him. Most surprisingly, Jason found himself reconnecting with Elena, the woman whose marriage proposal he had declined 7 years earlier when unable to contemplate a future while his family's fate remained un. Their cautious reconnection, coffee meetings that extended into dinner conversations, shared reflections on the years between, suggested possibilities that Jason had long ago abandoned. While he made no promises about what might develop, he found himself for the first time in nearly 2 decades able to consider a life defined by more than the search for truth about his family's disappearance. As the sun began to set over Hawthorne Reservoir, casting long shadows across the water that had both concealed and ultimately revealed the truth, Jason reached into his pocket and withdrew 3 items: his father's water-damaged ID, restored by forensic technicians, his mother's silver locket, found among the Winnebago's recovered contents, and Abby's necklace, discovered at the inlet where she had made her last stand. These personal effects, released to him now that they were no longer needed as evidence, represented not just what had been lost, but what had been found: the truth of his family's final hours and the revelation of who they truly were. Mark Chandler had died trying to expose corruption that threatened public health. Lisa Chandler had supported her husband's principles even at great personal risk. And Abby, whose final recorded words had helped break open the case, had fought to the end to ensure the truth would eventually emerge, standing at the edge of the water that had held his family's fate for so many years. Jason performed a simple, private ceremony of remembrance. He didn't discard the precious items. They would return home with him, kept safe as tangible connections to those he had lost. But he did release something else: the consuming need to know that had driven him for 17 years, the single-minded focus that had both sustained him and limited him. The truth had been uncovered, justice was being pursued, and the full story would be remembered. For the first time since that summer day in 2003, when his family had departed on their final journey, Jason Chandler turned away from Hawthorne Reservoir feeling not completion. Grief never truly ended, but a sense of forward motion, of a life that could now be lived rather than merely endured. As he walked back to his vehicle, he paused once to look over his shoulder at the water reflecting the sunset's glow. "I found you," he whispered, words carried away by the gentle spring breeze. Then he continued on, leaving footprints in the damp earth that the rising waters would eventually erase, but carrying with him memories that neither time nor water could ever wash away. The drive back to town felt different somehow. Jason had made this journey countless times over the years, but always with the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on him. Now, though the grief remained, the desperate urgency had lifted. In its place was a sense of possibility he hadn't felt since before that fateful summer. He thought about the Foundation's first project, water quality monitoring, at 3 sites where Thermax had dumped toxic waste, scheduled to begin next month. He thought about Elena, who had invited him to dinner at her place this weekend. And for the first time in 17 years, he thought about his own future without guilt or reservation.